Good evening. Today is August 5th, and this is Kingdom News. My name is Siobhan Singh, and here are the headlines for today. Charitable giving remains strong despite COVID-19 pandemic. Al Mohler denounces New York Times and the media for blaming churches for spreading COVID-19. And John MacArthur addresses critics and says it's not the church spreading anything but the gospel. Now for the news and details. Giving to charity in the U.S. remains strong despite the ongoing novel coronavirus pandemic, according to a new study of donors and their attitudes. The report, which is called Charitable Giving in the Wake of COVID-19 and was conducted in May and June, found that 85% of 1,079 U.S. donors who were surveyed online expect the amount they regularly give to charity to remain at last year's level or increase in the latter half of this year. Fewer than 10% of donors intend to shift support to new or different causes as a result of COVID-19, and over 70% who financially contributed to pandemic relief efforts said those donations were over and above their normal giving. The report also found, and I quote, "Our clients during the first part of the pandemic started receiving very generous gifts, and these nonprofit leaders were elated, but they were also concerned that these gifts would be the last they would see this year and would potentially curtail services to vulnerable populations," said Paul Martin, a senior partner with Dickerson Backer, in a phone interview with the Christian Post on Tuesday. Overwhelmingly, donors are generous. When nonprofits ask us, hey, some of our people have lost their job, or maybe their businesses are not as productive and profitable as they once were, the advice that we give those leaders of nonprofits is, don't make decisions for your donors, let them make the decisions, he said. God may have called them to a specific place, and their ministry is to be able to fulfill that donation, so let them be. Southern Baptist Theological Seminary President Albert Mohler Jr. denounced the New York Times and other media outlets that seem to blame churches for the spread of COVID-19. In an episode of Mohler's podcast, The Briefing, on Monday, the Southern Baptist leader critically analyzed an article published by the New York Times last month that accused churches of being the epicenter of infections worldwide. Mohler noted that the piece, published on July 8th and updated on July 10th, listed 650 confirmed novel coronavirus cases linked to 40 churches. 365 of those infections cited by the Times were in Union County, Oregon, many of which were reportedly linked to a church following a wedding that was attended by guests from out of town. Mohler then pointed to a USA Today article released several days later, which reported the same 650 cases and used the New York Times piece as its source. In response to state orders to shut down businesses and churches in late March, the vast majority of congregations decided to hold in-person worship services as a precaution until states slowly began allowing services to reopen. Many congregations have reopened their doors, but some quickly decided to shut back down after COVID-19 infections spiked among their church members. Nevertheless, many take issue with the media blaming churches for spreading the virus, especially congregations that observe social distancing guidelines, noting that there are other possible factors for the spike in cases. John MacArthur responded to a pastor's criticisms of his church's decision to reopen in defiance of Governor Gavin Newsom's second round of lockdown orders, saying his church is not spreading anything but the gospel. "We are a friend to the society, to every level of the society. We have been given awards and accolades and plaques from the city government, the police department, all in authority, because they recognize that what an honorable congregation this church has been," he said. MacArthur's comments were made in response to Pastor Gavin Otland, senior pastor of First Baptist Church of Ojai, who wrote in a blog post that while he affirms the vital importance of corporate worship, he believes the current situation is more complicated than MacArthur's perspective allows. According to Ortland, there are at least 4 biblical values that should inform the church's decision making in this situation: the importance of worship, love for neighbor, obedience to government, and maintaining a good witness. The Constitution doesn't give them the power to do that, he stressed, and they don't certainly have the spiritual power to usurp the place that only Jesus Christ has over his church. California's restrictions for indoor religious gatherings include a ban on singing, as chanting and singing negate the risk reduction achieved through 6 feet of physical distancing, according to health officials. At least 3 churches in California have already sued the state for banning singing and chanting in places of worship, calling it an unconstitutional abuse of power. Ed Young, founding and senior pastor of Fellowship Church, is challenging churches across the U.S. to reopen their doors, warning that the spiritual ramification of refusing to meet outweigh the hype of the coronavirus pandemic. Look at our culture. There is so much going on right now spiritually, especially among young people facing depression, anxiety, and attempting suicide. Young, who leads the evangelical megachurch in Grapevine, Texas, told the Christian Post. He stated, "I have counted the cost of not opening our church versus opening, and I believe that risk and faith go hand in hand. It's critical to reopen churches. I understand where these pastors are coming from, but I disagree," Young said. I can't guarantee I will be in a 100% safe environment when I take my trash down to my street. It's simply not doable. I just don't want us to lose our boldness, and I don't want the church to mail it in. Throughout church history, the church has not mailed it in. We have stood in pandemics, we have stood during wars, and in all sorts of chaos and mayhem. Today, technology has allowed us to take the easy way out. According to Young, the Fellowship Church sanctuary underwent thorough cleaning before the services and again between each service. Congregants were provided with face masks and social distancing was maintained. We had to really work in some unique things to make our church COVID-19 ready, and it wasn't easy, he admitted. But since reopening, the response has been incredible, he said, adding that within the last few months, Fellowship Church has seen an uptick in first-time visitors, conversions, and spiritual engagements. Young said there are more questions than answers when it comes to COVID. Still, he believes physical worship is important to God, and so it should matter to the body of Christ. He says, "I want to applaud the churches that are reopening and would encourage the ones who aren't to really think through why they aren't reopening," he said. "Something supernatural happens when we gather physically in a house of worship. I believe the risk of not coming together is greater than the risk of meeting." The newly appointed head of faith outreach for former Vice President Joe Biden's presidential campaign is working on getting evangelicals to support the Democratic nominee. Josh Dixon, an evangelical Christian who has been active in the Democratic Party for nearly 10 years, was appointed National Faith Engagement Director for the Biden campaign. During the Obama administration, for a time, Dixon worked as the director of the Center for Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships at the U.S. Department of Commerce. Dixon believes some evangelicals are moving toward supporting Biden. An example of this, he said, is seeing evangelical leaders embrace of the Black Lives Matter movement. "We have seen evangelicals marching in the streets. We have seen evangelicals talking about Black Lives Matter and speaking and praising Black Lives Matter," said Dixon. "We have seen a tremendous response from individual pastors who have large followings who have marched in the streets. We've seen leaders, elected leaders, who have marched in the streets from evangelical backgrounds." Pastor Robert Jeffress of First Baptist Dallas, a longtime supporter of President Donald Trump, recently denounced evangelicals who plan to vote for Biden in November. "The only evangelicals who are going to vote for Joe Biden are those who have sold their soul to the devil and accepted the Democrats' barbaric position on abortion," declared Jeffress in an interview with Lou Dobbs on Fox Business. "I mean, it's so barbaric. Joe Biden believes in unrestricted abortion. He can't even get his own church, the Catholic Church, to stomach it. They have denied him communion because of that." Dixon also reiterated his belief that the problem of systemic racial injustice that our country has been perpetuating since its founding will be the issue of this election. It started with a van full of paint cans on the streets of New York outside the Black Lives Matter mural in Midtown Manhattan. And then Bevelyn Betty began her task, dropping to her knees with paint in hand, yelling, "They don't care about Black lives, they are liars." Finally came her arrest as she chanted, "Jesus matters, Jesus matters, stand up and take your country back." Bevelyn Betty's actions and video went viral last month, and she tells CBN News she had one thing on her mind the whole time. "I have to paint this mural. I have to cover this mural," she explains from her home in New Jersey. "I was so tired of this Black Lives Matter narrative. We're going to hit it. We're going to fight, and we're going to stand, and God is with me," and that was it. To understand Bevelyn Betty's actions and motive, you need to know her backstory. She grew up in the inner city on welfare. After seeing people close to her die, Betty went out on her own, got into trouble, and 7 years ago wound up in jail on money laundering charges. It was there where someone shared the gospel with her, and she gave her life to Jesus Christ. "When I got out of jail, honey, you couldn't get me to steal a pack of bubblegum," she said. "You couldn't get me to do nothing." And then there's the violence she's seen. Black Lives Matter will never address black-on-black crime, she says. As Black people, we are headed towards extinction. Black Americans won't exist no more by 2050 with the route that we're going, because if we're not killing each other on the streets, we are aborting each other's babies. She sees politics, especially the Democrat Party, driving it all. "They're using us. They've been constantly using us," she said, "and we keep giving them the votes. That's why Joe Biden had the audacity to say, 'If you don't vote for me, you ain't Black.' She's fed up with all of it. She sees America changing before her very eyes and wants to see other Christians rise up with her. Christians have to recognize that if we don't stand up and smell the coffee, we're going to give away our freedoms, and America is going to turn into a communist country," she says. She continued, "Once America turns into a communist country, the world will be communism, and we will be back in the days of Noah." "We are all going to die, and this is what that looks like." Julie Tagore recalled thinking to herself as the entire building shook and glass shattered around her. She is one of many Lebanese who in Beirut Tuesday evening, when a massive explosion at the port flattened entire neighborhoods and sent billowing red and orange mushroom clouds towards the sky. "At first, I thought it was an earthquake," Julie told CBN News. The glass started shattering on the floor. "I thought the entire building was going to collapse on us." Tuesday's port explosion killed at least 100 people and wounded more than 4,000. Officials expect the toll to rise as countless people are missing, believed to be trapped under mountains of debris. Julie, a Lebanese Christian and researcher at the Philos Project, said two predominantly Christian neighborhoods in Beirut, Mar Makal and Gamai, were hit particularly hard. Everyone was either lightly wounded or they were just in disbelief. "I mean, when you would walk, you could tell that it was just a post-apocalyptic scene," she explained. "The extent of the damage has left us speechless." The blast devastated churches and religious centers in Lebanon. Video on Twitter shows a priest giving mass as a loud explosion shakes the church. Stained glass windows burst as his parishioners attempt to flee the crumbling house of worship. The cause of the catastrophic blast is still under investigation. Lebanese officials say it appeared the explosion was caused by the detonation of more than 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate that was being stored in a warehouse at the port after it was confiscated from a cargo ship in 2014. U.S. President Donald Trump said Tuesday military generals told him they seemed to feel the explosion was a terrible attack. The Trump administration has awarded more than $35 million in grants from the Justice Department to organizations that provide safe housing for survivors of human trafficking. The president stated very early in the administration that he would put the full force and weight of this government on ending human trafficking, arguably the gravest of human rights violations, said Ivanka Trump, a daughter of President Donald Trump. The grants will be shared by 73 organizations in 33 states. They will provide 6 to 24 months of help for transitioning or short-term housing. COVID has really underscored the urgency, said Ivanka Trump. Housing assistance is the #1 need. Trump was joined by human trafficking survivors who shared their stories. My aspirations, my personal vision for my future was of no concern to my trafficker, said Tanya Gord, a survivor. So personally, this experience to be heard and to be valued has helped me advance on my path of wholeness, and I'm forever grateful, she said. I'm very grateful for our leadership, said Attorney General William Barr. It's leaders like you who do so much for the victims that frankly were inspired at the Justice Department. The grant money can also be used to help victims find permanent housing, get a job, and receive occupational training and counseling. At least 6 people are dead and millions are without power after Tropical Storm Isaias tore up the East Coast. The storm, which first struck as a Category 1 hurricane, plowed into the Carolinas and quickly traveled all the way to New England. Despite its fast speed, it left plenty of tragedy in the wake. Isaias unleashed tornadoes, heavy rain, and flooding, along with winds gusts of more than 100 miles per hour. For some, the storm turned deadly, taking the lives of 2 people in North Carolina after a tornado slammed into a neighborhood. Bertie County Sheriff John Holy said 10 mobile homes had been demolished. All my officers are down there at this time. Pretty much the entire trailer park is gone, he said. Survivor Heidi Goya recalled, we took shelter, just my son and I were here. We ran to the center of the house and got in the closet, and then it was gone as quickly as it started. 3 others were killed by falling trees and limbs in Maryland, New York City, and Delaware. In the aftermath of Isaias, officials project the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia to crest at more than 15 feet. That's the highest level in more than 150 years. Outside the city, rescuers help children get to safety from a second-story window. Residents still need to be on their guard along the East Coast. Even as the storm moves out, flooding is a big threat in some areas. Israel is putting aside hostilities with Lebanon and offering humanitarian aid to the country after a catastrophic explosion Tuesday evening wreaked havoc on Beirut, killing dozens and injuring thousands. We share the pain of the Lebanese people and sincerely reach out to offer our aid at this difficult time, said Israeli President Reuven Rivlin. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said he instructed the head of Israel's National Security Council to speak with the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, Nikolay Mildevnov, to discuss how the Jewish state can help Lebanon. Israel approached Lebanon through international defense and diplomatic channels to offer the Lebanese government medical humanitarian aid. Defense Minister Benny Gantz and Foreign Minister Gabi Ashkenazi said in a joint statement. Although Israel and Lebanon are enemies in times of war, the Israel Defense Forces said this is the time to transcend conflict. Lebanon is not expected to accept the aid offer, but Iran has offered to help. Lebanon is home to the Iranian-backed Hezbollah terror group, which Israel fought a bloody war against in 2006. Tensions between Israel and Hezbollah have spiked in recent days after the IDF said it thwarted an attempted infiltration attempt by the terror group. Hezbollah denies its men were involved in the incident, but has threatened to attack the Jewish state after it said one of its fighters was killed in an airstrike in Syria last month. Israel said it was not responsible for the explosion in Beirut. The blast killed at least 100 people and more than 4,000 were wounded. Officials from the Lebanese Red Cross expect the toll to rise. Windows shattered, people were sent flying through the air, and towering silos crumbled. It is unclear what caused the explosion at the port, which appeared to have been triggered by a fire. Local TV initially reported that a fireworks warehouse was involved. Interior Minister Mohammed Fahmy told a local television station that it appeared the blast was caused by the detonation of more than 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate that was being stored in a warehouse at the port after it was confiscated from a cargo ship in 2014. Witnesses reported seeing an orange cloud of what appeared to be toxic nitrogen dioxide gas after the explosion. In the early days of the pandemic, churches shut their doors to keep their congregants safe. More than 5 months later, many remain closed, either by government order or choice. As churches across the country grapple with when and how to safely reopen their doors, some pastors say they won't resume regular services until 2021. That's a big change from earlier this year when many thought the coronavirus shutdown would only last a few weeks. While some have resumed traditional Sunday services, a growing number of pastors say the virus remains too much of a risk. Pastor Andy Stanley of Atlanta's North Point Community Church recently announced plans to continue virtual services for the rest of the year. Stanley, who leads the 40,000 member congregation, says he can't ensure people's safety for in-person services. Others like Pastor Brian Tome with Crossroad Church in Cincinnati, Ohio, believe that in-person worship services are over for the rest of the year. We're not going to go back into buildings for the rest of 2020, Pastor Tom said. As the COVID uncertainty stretches into August, the number of people watching online services has also declined from the record numbers seen 4 or 5 months ago. Hurricane Isaias made landfall overnight in the Carolinas, coming ashore near Myrtle Beach with 85-mile-an-hour winds as a Category 1 hurricane. Residents of the Carolina coast were prepared for the worst, but the storm still left a deadly path, killing at least 4 people as it spawned numerous tornadoes. Downgraded to a tropical storm after landfall, Isaias knocked out power to 2.8 million electric customers across North Carolina, Virginia, and other states, along with tornado warnings. In Windsor, North Carolina, at least 2 people were killed and others left missing, and more than 20 people injured when a suspected tornado touched down at a mobile park. Many sheltered in place, but with coronavirus fears, evacuees were getting their temperatures checked before entering shelters. Thailand's medical center in Myrtle Beach, which had to call in the National Guard weeks ago to help handle COVID-19 cases, was preparing for more patients after the storm. Dr. William Richmond said, "Been here 35 years, we've never seen a situation like this, where the hospital has seen this much stress." In parts of Richmond, Suffolk, and Portsmouth, Virginia, families there are beginning to pick up the pieces after downed trees caused severe damage to multiple homes. Power companies from North Carolina to New Jersey have been deploying crews trying to restore electricity to 760,000 people. As protesters continue to talk about racism in America, many point to something called the 1619 Project. It's presented by the New York Times as a more truthful beginning of the United States than what many of us learned about our country's founding. The 1619 Project is an ongoing narrative first published in the New York Times Magazine in late last August, marking the anniversary of the arrival of African slaves to the shores of America 400 years ago in 1619. Joan goes on to say the 1619 Project never pretended to be history, which begs the question as to why it has been packaged as a curriculum for K-12 students, with many school districts planning to adopt it. Among its claims are the idea that the American Revolution was launched in order to ensure slavery would continue, and that modern American capitalism has its root in plantation slavery. Robert Woodson, the founder of the Woodson Center, an organization that seeks to strengthen and uplift Black communities, strongly disagrees with the goals of the 1619 Project, saying in a recent Wall Street Journal opinion article that it hurts Black Americans by casting them as perpetual victims while ignoring Black America's long history of success and achievement. A life-size statue of the late evangelist Billy Graham is scheduled to replace a statue of a white supremacist in the U.S. Capitol's Statuary Hall next year. Religion News Service reports a North Carolina legislative committee endorsed a 2-foot model of the statue of the famous evangelist by sculptor Chris Fagan. The final version of the statue will be a towering 10 feet tall. Fagan has designed and sculpted several statues of other religious figures, including St. John Paul II and Mother Teresa. The Capitol Statuary Hall collection has 100 statues of outstanding U.S. citizens. States can place 2 statues in the collection. A native of North Carolina, Graham was born on a farm near Charlotte. He died in 2018. The statue will stand in the place of a statue of Charles Aycock, a former governor of the Tar Heel State. Aycock was one of the masterminds of the 1898 Wilmington, North Carolina race riots and coup, in which a local government made up of Black Americans was overthrown and replaced by white officials. North Carolina's other statue is of Zebulon Vance, a former governor and U.S. senator who was once a Confederate military officer, according to the RNS. The new statue will portray Graham as he appeared in the 1960s, preaching and holding a Bible in one hand. A set of long-lost sisters in Nebraska just experienced the reunion of a lifetime. Believe it or not, because of COVID-19, Bev Burrow, 53, had been searching for her older sister for years, but she only had her last name to go on. Then during a routine day of work at the rehab center, she saw a name on a whiteboard that caught her eye. Her 73-year-old sister, Doris Crippen, had just been admitted for recovery after falling and breaking her arm. She had been battling COVID-19 for 30 days, so her body was weak and frail. The sisters say there were 5 siblings, all separated and adopted by different families more than 50 years ago. The sisters agree that finding each other was unexpected, but a sweet surprise. I've missed out on her life and she's missed out on mine. But we found each other. It was the Lord's blessing that I got sent here, because if I wasn't sent here, I'd never had found her or the rest of my brothers and sisters, Crippen concluded. Senator Ted Cruz has sent a follow-up letter to Defense Secretary Mark Esper, raising his concerns about religious discrimination in the Department of Defense and how the department should address its culture of hostility towards religion. The department must do better. It must take affirmative steps to those in its ranks from targeting religious individuals and violating the United States Constitution, Cruz said in the letter, according to Fox News. The Texas senator specifically asked about the case of Christian Air Force veteran Jay Lorenzen, who was scheduled to speak at an annual training event for Marine Corps, the JAG reservists, last month. Lorenzen's presentation was canceled after the Military Religious Freedom Foundation voiced its reservist client's concern that Lieutenant Colonel Lorenzen's comments would be influenced by his beliefs. Lorenzen was scheduled to make 3 presentations on leadership at the training event. In the letter, Cruz reminded Esper the Constitution protects the free exercise of religion. The First Amendment unambiguously protects the free exercise of religion. More to the point, it protects religious observers against unequal treatment on the basis of religious status. The government is prohibited from discriminating against individuals based on their religious faith or religious practices. Nevertheless, the department is unabashedly discriminating against religious individuals, the senator wrote. The department must do better, Cruz added. It must take affirmative steps to stop those in the ranks from targeting religious individuals and violating the United States Constitution. Our brave servicemen and women deserve to have their religious and spiritual needs met without fear that their faith will subject them to special burdens. First Liberty Institute, which represents a JAG reservist opposed to the cancellation, told Fox News that Lorenzen wouldn't have included religious elements in his talk. Lorenzen himself has declined to comment on the situation. Federal authorities say one of the gravest threats to the November election is a well-timed ransomware attack that could paralyze voting operations. The threat isn't just from foreign governments, but any fortune-seeking criminal. Ransomware attacks targeting state and local governments have been on the rise, with cyber criminals seeking quick money by seizing data and holding it hostage until they get paid. The fear is that such attacks could affect voting systems directly or even indirectly by infecting broader government networks that include electoral databases. Even if a ransomware attack fails to disrupt elections, it could nonetheless rattle confidence in the votes. On the spectrum of threats from the fantastical to the more probable, experts and officials say ransomware is a particularly realistic possibility because the attacks are already so pervasive and lucrative. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security have issued advisories to local governments, including recommendations for preventing attacks. From the standpoint of confidence in the system, I think it is much easier to disrupt a network and prevent it from working and operating than it is to change votes. Adam Hickey, a Justice Department Deputy Assistant Attorney General, said in an interview. The scenario is relatively simple. plant malware on multiple networks that affect voter registration databases and activated just before an election, or target vote reporting and tabulation systems. Tech entrepreneur Elon Musk is not a religiously observant person, but he admitted earlier this week that he prayed about his SpaceX project. In remarks after the Dragon capsule completed its splash landing in the Gulf of Mexico on Sunday, bringing home 2 U.S. astronauts, the chief engineer and CEO of SpaceX said at one point during his speech, "You know, I'm not very religious, but I prayed for this one. Musk has long planned to make living on Mars a viable option. We're going to go to the moon, we're going to have a base on the moon, and we're going to send people to Mars and make life multiplanetary," he said. NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine believes space travel is going to become increasingly common in part because of private sector innovation. He says we are entering a new era of human spaceflight when NASA is no longer the purchaser, owner, and operator of all the hardware. We are going to be a customer. One customer of many customers in a very robust commercial marketplace for human spaceflight to low Earth orbits. He added, "We also want to have numerous providers that are competing against each other on cost and innovation and safety, driving down costs and increasing access to space in a way that's never been seen before." Musk believes the recent space accomplishments represent an achievement of humanity. A historic New York City church has decided to devote $200,000, about a tenth of its budget, to provide housing assistance and youth anti-racism training. The Reverend Jacqueline Lewis, the African-American leader of the multi-ethnic Middle Collegiate Church, said the initiative is a way for her church to make amends. She noted that the church began after Dutch Reformed settlers bought the land that eventually became Manhattan from the Lenape, a Native American nation, in an unfair transaction. Its early clergy also included slaveholders. "We are doing reparations," she said of the plans for a portion of the church's $2.3 million budget for the fiscal year that started July 1st. Half of the $200,000 is aimed at addressing the needs of New Yorkers whose CARES Act unemployment benefits may have been lost as of July 31st, so they don't lose their housing, she said. Many have lost jobs during the coronavirus pandemic and can no longer afford rent and mortgages. The other $100,000 will be used for partnerships with organizations that assist homeless Black and brown queer teens, and to help form a peacemaking, anti-racist cadre of young people who are learning what adults are learning about anti-racism and how to make a more just America. Lewis, the senior minister of the 1,400-member church that dates to 1628, said the congregation is able to take these steps because of the money it expects to raise through ongoing adult anti-racist training programs, which has drawn a total of 4,400 people in recent months, as well as from its annual Revolutionary Love Conference, which has attended virtually in 2020 by more than 600 paying attendees in April. "What we are learning is that we have a way to protest," she said of programs that have gained interest in the wake of demonstrations about George Floyd, a Black man who died in May under the knee of Minneapolis police officer. "We have a way to change the story on racism in America, even while we're sheltered, and people are responding." Lewis said she's joining other clergies who have taken action on social justice in non-traditional ways. A Christian college in Eugene, Oregon is standing against radical activists who want to deface or tear down a cross that has stood on the campus for decades. Members of Antifa claim that cross is a racist symbol and they want it removed from the private campus of New Hope Christian College. In a Facebook post, the college wrote that the cross embodies hope and the unconditional love from our Heavenly Father. The history of the cross and how it came to reside on our campus has been well documented over the years, and there is no evidence to suggest our cross has direct roots to racism other than it once resided on Skinner Butte, the same location where racist events were held in the 1920s. People referring to our cross as the KKK cross is false. The school says the cross was not around at that time and didn't even exist until many decades later. From 1934 to 1964, Wooden crosses were displayed on Skinner Butte. These crosses were not associated with the racist activities of the 1920s, but simply powerful symbols of hope set high above the city of Eugene. Antifa agitators were also in Portland over the weekend, where they burned the Bibles and an American flag in front of a federal courthouse. The riots have drawn thousands to the city park in front of Portland's federal courthouse. Some say they are protesting for racial justice. Others want to defund the police nationwide. Reporting from the scene, CBN News contributing reporter Chuck Holton said it's clear that most of those participating in the riots don't want to abolish the police, but instead want to act like the police to enforce their own agenda. Here's a recap of today's news. Charitable giving remains strong despite the COVID-19 pandemic. And Al Muller denounces the New York Times and the media for blaming churches for spreading COVID-19. John MacArthur addresses critics and says the church is not spreading anything but the gospel. Today's news was taken from CBN News, The Christian Post, Christian Headlines, and Charisma News. My name is Siobhan Singh, and this is Kingdom News. Until next time, do have a good evening.